Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Ginya Sweeney. I'm the Director of Interpretation here at the Art Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this morning's program. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. It's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker for this morning's program, Emily Ziemba, curator of the exhibition Matisse's Jazz, Rhythms in Color. I've had the good fortune to work with Emily on this exhibition, which highlights Matisse's landmark artist book, Jazz. Throughout the project, Emily's deep knowledge of and curiosity about these works has guided the development of the exhibition. Emily is the Director of Curatorial Administration and Research Curator for the Department of Prints and Drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago. Since joining the museum in 2001, she has contributed to several exhibitions, including The Artist and the Poet, Undressed, The Fashion of Privacy, Helen Frankenthaler Prints, The Romance of a New Medium, Mel Bachner Drawings, a Retrospective, Ellsworth Kelly Portrait Drawings, and most recently, 2024's Picasso Drawing from Life. In 2017, Emily was selected for the first exchange of German-American provenance researchers organized by the Smithsonian Institution and the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation National Museums in Berlin. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Emily to the stage.
Hi. Before I begin, I just want to apologize in advance if I cough. I'm nursing a head cold, so I'm going to try really hard because I owe it to you all. But, welcome. Thank you all for coming today to take a deeper look into Matisse's Jazz, Rhythms in Color, the current exhibition in the Prints and Drawings galleries. Today, we'll delve a bit deeper into jazz, what it is, and the role it played in the last 10 years of Matisse's career, the way it integrated his lifelong exploration of color and line, while simultaneously inventing a new medium, his cut paper. We'll conclude our time together by examining the broader personal and political context of its creation during the height of World War II and the Nazi occupation of Europe. So let's dive right in, shall we? So what is jazz, and why is it significant? First and foremost, jazz is an unbound, illustrated book with images and text by Matisse. Published in 1947, it is considered one of, if not the, most beautiful and important artist books of the 20th century. Our exhibition not only celebrates jazz, but strives to contextualize it within Matisse's oeuvre. Placing it within the larger context of Matisse's career shows, at least I hope it does, that jazz was a critical turning point in his artistic development. Jazz proved that his paper cutouts could be a standalone media and not merely a tool to a further end. And just as importantly, Matisse finally joined the two most essential artistic elements, color and line, to his satisfaction for the first time. Now, I don't think I need to introduce Matisse to this crowd, but these are two works that literally put him on the map, solidified his leadership among the French avant-garde, and anointed him the unofficial leader of the Fauves, or wild beasts, the artists who push color and representation to its extreme. In his Notes of a Painter from 1908, Matisse wrote, "What I am after, above all, is expression." But you can see that from the very beginning, color and line existed separately. And what I mean by that is that line, his drawings, are almost always monochromatic. Graphite, pen and ink, brush and black ink. He never used watercolor. He didn't use pastel. He reserved that vibrant color for his paintings, where they are literally splashed on the paint with broad strokes, fields of color. And that trend continued into his Nice period, which started in 1917. By the way, we also suspect that the same model is depicted in both this painting and the drawing, that being Antoinette Arnaud. And the trend continues into the 1930s. I think this slide most succinctly illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. that color and line, they modify each other. Either a line is resting on a field of color, like the painting Daisies, or tone fills in a space delineated by a line, as in the drawing. But the two, color and line, are never fully integrated. And then came 1941. This is a pivotal year for the artist. His surgery for duodenal cancer was excruciating. He nearly died and remained in the hospital for over 2 months. The nuns who cared for him called him the resurrected one. Matisse wrote to his son Pierre, "I am not a wounded man, I am a mutilated one." The resulting long recovery made it physically impossible for him to stand at the easel for periods to paint. He told Pierre, "I no longer have the muscles that normally hold the left side of my stomach in place. I am seriously incapacitated. On top of that, I am subject to spasms that give me great pain." To his daughter, Marguerite, he described himself as someone hit by a shell blast, with the wall of his stomach blown away. And so, his artistic impulses forced him to adapt, and as a result, he turned to drawing, as seen here on the left, where he literally draws himself in the act of drawing in the lowest part of the drawing, and then later to cut paper. So what do I mean when I say cut paper? It's a sort of three-pronged process. The first is that studio assistants painted sheets of white paper from end to end, side to side, in varying shades of gouache paint, that's a water-based paint, pinned them to the wall to dry. Then, as inspiration struck, Matisse would select a piece of paper and cut forms from them. And I do want to add, the scissors he used were enormous. I don't know how he didn't cut his fingers off. They were clearly like textile shears. It's truly impressive. So next time you go into the galleries and you see these little forms, think of, foot-long shears. And then he would pin those onto a secondary support that you see in the right. He would use a board and lay it across his lap and then pin all of these into a composition. When it was finished, when he was satisfied, they would spot glue those onto the secondary support and remove the pins. And here is what those final compositions look like after having been glued down. These are maquettes that would later become jazz. They now reside in the Pompidou in Paris. The experience making the 20 maquettes for jazz ushered in an entirely new art form: his cutouts. Matisse was obsessed with this new technique for the rest of his life. Quote, "The paper cutouts allow me to draw with color. For me, it is a simplification. Instead of drawing an outline and then filling in the color with one modifying the other, I draw it directly in color. It is not a starting point, it is a completion." The discovery of this new medium reinvigorated Matisse and launched the final chapter of his career. But the jazz cutouts were not the first time he employed the technique. The Barnes mural commission in 1931 started with cut paper. And here are those examples. However, you can see clearly from this that the technique was employed to study the composition and make editorial adjustments. It's not a standalone media. Even earlier than the Barnes Commission, Matisse used cut paper while working on stage and costume designs for the Ballet Russe, first in 1920 and again in 1938. And I'll point out that in the middle image, we're pretty sure that he's pinning paper to the dancer's costume. And here are two surviving examples from the 1938 production of Rouge et Noir. On the left, you can see the pins that are still holding those layers of cut paper in place, whereas on the right, the once pinned paper has now been glued to its support. Okay, so now it's time to introduce an essential character to the story, Tériade. He's shown here on the left with Matisse. Because without Tériade, who knows if jazz would have ever come to fruition? The two men first met in 1932 while Matisse worked on his first true artist book, The Poems of Mallarmé, with the publisher Albert Schira, while Tériade was the firm's artistic director. The Mallarmé book was a huge success, and the two men developed a close friendship. And I do want to say an aside here, as his first book, the project introduced Matisse to the dilemma of the balance between image and text, the way the two play off of each other in the design. So that experience proved critical when it came to jazz. So when Tériade left Skira to start his own firm, and eventually his journal Verve, it's not surprising that he asked his friend Matisse to design the cover for the very first issue, shown here in the center. Matisse also designed a cover on the eve of World War II, but its publication was delayed undoubtedly to the war. It was not released until 1940. Both covers were designed using cut paper, but reproduced using color lithography. On June 1st, 1943, Tériade came to see Matisse in Nice to ask for another cover for Verve, and the artist showed him some things that he was working on. While we can't be certain, we believe it was these two maquettes that would later become jazz. Tériade immediately recognized the importance of these new works. Quote, "This was a historic moment in modern painting. Matisse had just discovered a new pictorial device." And you can see here that Matisse was still inspired by that work that he had been doing with the Ballet Russe, those costume designs. The clown from Jazz appears as a sinister, almost flame-licked elaboration of his earlier dancers. The clown is trapped in a prison of black. And again, the falling figure carries over from two dancers on the left to the jazz plate toboggan on the right. After seeing these images, Tériade enthusiastically proposed a new book project. Matisse welcomed the idea and set to work on additional compositions. Matisse likely considered this image for the cover of the book. It even reads like the jacket of a book, if you can imagine it turning it on its side, so Cirque on the front and the back with a blue spine. And as a result, most of the images in Jazz relate to the circus and its various acts. Here in this image, you see a banner in striking yellow announcing the circus, while a red carpet, or perhaps a safety net for a tightrope walker, silhouetted on the right. Matisse was obviously recalling happier times spent attending the circus in Paris. And here you can see that same dramatic light that was spotlighting the tightrope walker, but here the lion tamer. Other acts include the trapeze artist, and the title for this work is called the Codamas, which is a callback to the this one I can't ever say, famous family of flyers. Try saying that 3 times fast. The Cadona family. And so it's a tongue-in-cheek reference to that family. The plate, you can see those little yellow squiggles are the trapeze artists flying through the air, and those black squares are their safety net below them. Other circus acts include the horse, the rider, and the clown. The clown is the green and yellow figure in the corner. And the knife thrower, I think you can tell which one is the studio, the act. The assistant there is on the right. And another performer, the sword swallower. And the swimmer in the tank may be from a circus performance, but Matisse might also be remembering French music halls that included swimming performers, like the Moulin Rouge, that until very recently still had a tank act. Matisse had probably seen female swimmers in large tanks like this one. In Jazz, he depicts a viewer in the audience in the red. Similarly, this image, the cowboy, immediately recalls cowboy routines that were popular in Parisian revues, such as the Folies Bergères. With this image, the cowboy on a rearing horse lassos a woman on the right, presumably. But Jazz also includes images from ancient mythology and children's fairy tales. Icarus, the boy who was given wings of wax and in his ambition flew too close to the sun, melted those wings and fell to his death. And the wolf from Little Red Riding Hood. There are 3 images called The Lagoon, which reveal Matisse's recall his trip to Tahiti in 1930. The text within Jazz calls the lagoons one of the 7 wonders of the paradise of painters. And once Matisse completed the maquettes, he handed them over to Tériade for printing, a process that proved much harder than anticipated. Several printmaking processes were attempted and abandoned, including woodcut, lithography, and screen printing, before landing on pochoir, or stencil. The trick was that Matisse was adamant that the colors in the reproductions exactly match his original designs, which were made using a water-based ink. Popular methods of reproduction, like color lithography, use oil-based ink. So they were never going to match. So Tériade enlisted the master printer Edmond Varel to print the works in pochoir. Nearly each color element had a corresponding stencil created from a thin sheet of metal. Some images from Jazz has as many as 20 stencils to make the image, and every print was hand-painted. So if you're thinking there was 250 books and then another 100 of just the plates, that's 350 times 20, and then for each stencil. So this is a video. I just wanted to show you how this would have been done. Careful registration is essential because you can't paint over paint. So you have to think about what's the missing spot, fold over the sheet of metal, carefully hand paint that element. So each one will be slightly unique. And imagine doing this 350 times. So the careful registration is absolutely essential. So while the plates went into production, which obviously took some time, Matisse turned his attention to the text. And here are just a couple of pages from over 90 pages of text. As Matisse explained, the writing served to balance out the chromatic vibrancy of his images. It's a way to sort of visually cleanse the palette before you move on to the next image. Between each full page plate, there are 4 pages of handwritten text, and between the half-page illustrations, there are 2, which creates its own kind of visual syncopation or rhythm. Matisse explained that the text serves only to accompany my colors. All that I really have to recount are observations and notes made during the course of my life as a painter. I ask of those who will have the patience to read these notes the indulgence usually granted to the writings of painters. He talks about the importance of originality, travel, happiness, the advice of an older artist to the next generation. And for all of us of the generation who actually would handwrite letters, I know it's an old it's an old way of communicating, but I love when you go through it, he sometimes misses a word, and so you'll have that little insert, and he'll write the word above, or in the uppermost image, he scratches it out because he misspelled it. So it's a very human way of looking at Matisse. So now you know what Jazz the book is about, and why the cut paper technique was pivotal within his career. But now I want to take us in a different direction. You see, I'm a history nerd at heart, and while researching Jazz, I found myself gravitating toward the moment in which it was created, that the impact that tumultuous moment in history had on the imagery in Jazz. So now it's not new that historians have viewed Jazz through the lens of World War II. But this book, Matisse at War by Christopher Gorham, which was just released last October, really reveals what Matisse, his friends, and his family, what they went through during these years, a time period that art historians tend to just sort of gloss over. They say Matisse sheltered in Nice during the war, but this book really goes into depth. And so if you want an engaging weekend read, I do highly recommend. By way of context, it's critical to point out that the arts were under attack. 1937 saw the infamous Degenerate Art Exhibition in Germany, Over 3 million people visited the show that derided the avant-garde and anything not seen as sufficiently Aryan. Of course, Matisse understood what was happening in Germany personally. You see, this painting, Bathers with a Turtle, was purchased by the Folkwang Museum shortly after it was completed in 1908. It was a centerpiece of its modern art collection until it was deaccessioned in 1937 by the Nazi regime and sold at the infamous Fischer auction in Switzerland in 1939. Curiously, Pierre Matisse, the New York-based art dealer and son of the artist, bid on this painting for Joseph Pulitzer Jr., who eventually gave it to the St. Louis Art Museum, where it still resides. So if we focus our attention on the Matisse family, by all accounts, they are very close, with everyone having a role in Henri's career. But by the 1930s, cracks were beginning to form. Amélie suffered debilitating depression, sometimes unable to get out of bed for lengths of a time. So eventually, the family brought in help. Enter Lydia Delektorskaya. She joined the family in 1932 as domestic help and nurse, and eventually studio assistant. Eventually, over the years, however, her ability to efficiently run everything Matisse created a rift between Henri and Amélie, and ultimately the family as the children were forced to choose a side. Her close working relationship with Matisse drew an ultimatum of his wife of over 40 years. It's her or it's me. And Matisse, of course, chose his wife, who left him anyway in 1939. At his request, probably begging, Lydia returned to work for Henri in his studio in Paris, where both were later caught up in the throng of people fleeing the city once war was declared with Germany. She said, "A decision had to be made there as to whether or not he would take me with him." And it's important to include Lydia in the story for several reasons. One is she is that critical studio assistant that painted the sheets of paper that would later be cut to form jazz. Two, she's really the only one who gives firsthand account of what these plates mean. And also, as a Russian national, she was particularly vulnerable to the Nazis and to the collaborationist Vichy government. So Matisse's commitment to her safety, his need to protect her, ultimately dictated many of his decisions that were made during this period. And here is Marguerite, Henri's first child, and probably his favorite. When she was a child, she modeled frequently for her father, and then she later ran his studio and business matters until she married. The two were extremely close. However, tension arose with Henri's apparent ambivalence toward the war and the occupation. Marguerite simply did not understand. She wrote to her father in 1943, "We cannot and must not be so disinterested in the times we live in those who suffer and die. As for me, I am made of the stuff of warriors, fanatics, and all those consumed by ardor." By the end of the year, she had joined the resistance. Known by various names to conceal her true identity, Marguerite ferried intelligence between the cities and the occupied zones, especially in Brittany. That intelligence was then taken to London. She was part of the FTP, the military arm of the Communist Party, which, in case of arrest, we don't know you, we cut off all ties. His estranged wife, Amélie, who was living apart from Matisse in Paris when the war broke out, also worked for the resistance. Strangely, once she left Henri, her depression seemed to dissipate. She typed communications for the communist underground, though according to her grandson, she may have been doing much more because she traveled all over the country. She was 73 years old. And she was later arrested shortly after her daughter, just after Easter in 1944. This attestation of Marguerite's service to the resistance reads in part, "We, the National Military Committee of French Free Fighters and Partisans, hereby certified that Dutuy Marguerite alias Monique, was engaged voluntarily in the ranks of the FTPF, an integral part of the French Forces of the Interior in January 1944 in the Paris region. She participated in numerous actions against the enemy as a liaison officer and a courier. She was arrested April 13th, 1944 during a meeting in Rennes, interned in Rennes, and deported. She fled on August 4th, 1944 from Belfort, where she secretly crossed into Switzerland, from where she was liberated. After his wife and daughter were arrested by the Gestapo, Matisse knew nothing of their fate for 3 months. A close friend wrote in her diary, "I know he scarcely sleeps anymore. Anguish for his wife and daughter gnaws at him ceaselessly." Matisse eventually learned that Madame Matisse was sentenced to a 6-month prison sentence, released in October 1944, but he heard nothing about his daughter. After narrowly escaping deportation to a German concentration camp, Marguerite sends this card to her father. In coded language, she describes her arrest, the torture she suffered during her 3-month incarceration, the train that was taking her to the German concentration camps, and the miracle of her liberation. She writes, "After a serious accident in Rennes on April 13th, I was hospitalized for 3 months. Then the long journey began, fortunately ending in Belfort August 26, 1944. 6 weeks in the mountains where I recovered, and after a few hours in Switzerland, here I am on my way to Paris. I had time to think when I was no longer in pain. I haven't heard from anyone since Easter. I hope to find out how you are in Paris when I arrive. I am well. I send you my love with the hope that all is well with your health and your work." What she doesn't say is that the nature of her incarceration and torture was so horrific that she tried and failed to kill herself. Marguerite and her father were finally reunited January 15th, 1945. They spent 2 weeks together, talking, looking at each other, and just listening to each other's stories. I identified so strongly with her memories that I was completely devastated. The nights plunged me into scenes of humanity that we usually escape in the routine of bourgeois life. However, they are still there in the world, where cruel moments are set free, but we are unaware of it. Matisse nevertheless drew his daughter very well. These drawings were made during that moment. Now, the Matisse men also participated in the resistance. Jean's wartime efforts are a little harder to pin down, but what we can tell is that he worked with the resistance and assisted British intelligence during the war. He may have also had a hand in sabotage, possibly even with explosives. Resistance fighters, such as Jean, were essential to the success of D-Day, as they sabotaged German relief efforts. And according to Eisenhower, the resistance played a considerable effort in the battle for Normandy and were of inestimable value. And Pierre did what he could from his gallery in New York City. In March 1942, Pierre Matisse installed his show on the exiles. He was helping exiled artists survive in New York. And in this image, you can see artists like Tanguy, Ernst, Chagall, Léger, Mondrian. Pierre Matisse was then later arrested in Spain, trying to help Miro flee in 1945. Venturing beyond the tight Matisse family, in December 1940, Varian Fry of the ERC, the Emergency Rescue Committee, went to Nice to convince Matisse to leave France. Fry recalled, in spite of the growing food shortages and the difficulty he was already having in finding canvases and pigments, he said he preferred to stay in France. Matisse did, however, sign up to be an undercover operative for the ERC. In this role, Matisse provided scarce materials to artists by sending them some of his own. Moreover, Matisse later told Fry's assistant, Charlie Fawcett, that he had a barn where he used to harbor refugees. And on the right, I'm showing you several artists that did flee France with the assistance of the ERC. Now, another essential person to the story in this moment is Louis Aragon, a French poet, one of the leading voices of the Surrealist movement, and a writer for the Resistance. Aragon was commissioned to write the introduction to Matisse's drawings, themes, and variations, which was published in 1943. The work required hours of interviews and thoughtful conversations between the two men, and as a result, they grew quite close. Aragon saw Matisse as an intellectual and cultural continuation for France, one that had been so humiliated by the Germans. It simply seemed to me that the time had come to be aware of the national reality of Matisse, because he was France. Perhaps speaking for both he and Matisse, Aragon said, "In spite of dangers, we see emigration as desertion. This country, my country, must not be abandoned at such an hour." Now remember, the images that would become jazz were created between 1943 and 44 at the height of World War II. In fact, fear of an Allied aerial assault was tangible. Nice went into preparation mode, and Matisse and Lydia had already started plans to evacuate to nearby Vence. The summer of 43 was the darkest moment of the whole period, as reported by Aragon, as the Germans entered Nice. Nazi soldiers even commandeered the basement of Matisse's home in Vence to use as a canteen. The fall of 43, Nice suffered through one of the most brutal manhunts in Western Europe, as Nazis and their French collaborators hunted Jews day and night. Thousands were deported. In early 1944, Matisse and Lydia were visited by the photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. After having escaped a German prisoner of war camp 3 times, he joined an underground organization assisting prisoners. While on the run, he stopped and visited Matisse and Lydia in Vence. This photo was taken during that visit. And another. Notice in the upper left corner those abstract forms. One of those is the maquette for forms, which appears in jazz. Those of you that know me know I have a thing for Picasso, so I have to throw him in any chance I can get, but this actually works, just trust me. So almost immediately after the fall of France, the Nazis started looting from Jewish collectors and gallerists. Understandably, Matisse was worried that they would come for his personal collections, that they were stored in the vaults of the National Bank in Paris. He wrote to Pierre, "I know what refined and robust removal men the Germans can be." Eventually, the Germans did enter his vault, escorted by Picasso, when they went through his vaults as well. Now, whatever Picasso said to the German soldiers worked, as they left without taking anything. Now, Francois Gillot explained how young people were sustained to know that neither Picasso nor Matisse had fled. Culture had to be upheld like a flag against Hitler's totalitarian empire, against his cult of Nietzschean values. Hitler was waging war against civilization as most understood it. Truth had to supersede the unleashed forces of darkness. Matisse's commitment to continuing to live and work in France was seen as a beacon of hope for the young. Gillot noted that artists at the time communicated through symbols in their art. Cryptic allusions were a necessity at the time, as the Germans monitored and censored everything. So now we understand how deeply affected those surrounding Matisse, his family, his friends, his colleagues, were by the war and the Nazi occupation. But now let's look at Matisse's art and jazz, again, through that lens of cryptic allusion that Gillot describes. Matisse said to an American journalist, "Many painters have told me that the war, for instance, has no way affected their painting. It is impossible. It is impossible that an artist should not feel the after effects of the war. That makes him take things more profoundly." Now remember this cover for Verve that Matisse delivered to Tériade in Paris, August 30th, 1939. It's composed of stylized fleur-de-lis on an overwhelming sea of black, not exactly a color that Matisse is known for. The fleur-de-lis would have been recognized as the ancient and enduring symbol of France set against this pure black background, perhaps a symbol of menace or the unknown. The following day, Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days later, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. The issue was only completed after the Germans invaded France and attacked Paris. Released June 1st, 1940, Matisse referred to it as the war number, and it was dedicated to France. In a letter to his daughter that month, Matisse wrote, "Each one of us must find his own way to limit the moral shock of this catastrophe. For myself, in order to prevent an avalanche overwhelming me, I'm trying to distract myself from it as far as possible by clinging to the idea of the future work I could still do if I don't let myself be destroyed." September 1st, 1940, Matisse explained why he did not use the visa to the United States that Pierre had secured for him. "It seemed to me as if it would be deserting. If everyone who has any value leaves France, what remains of France?" So here's another project that Matisse was working on during the war years. This book is in the show, by the way. The illustrated book of poetry by Charles d'Orléans. While it wasn't published until 1950, Matisse started working on it in 1942, so it is contemporaneous with jazz. The project sought to reclaim French literary history and pride, this time through the poetry of a 15th century nobleman who was held prisoner for 25 years during the 100 Years' War. Not surprising, the fleur-de-lis is repeated throughout, a symbolic call for unity. I'll also note that around this time, Matisse participated in 2 radio broadcasts. The second was particularly noteworthy because he railed against the École des Beaux-Arts and its conventional teachings. Its emphasis on technical proficiency and faithful or even heroic representation destroyed genuine creativity, according to Matisse. One could easily substitute Aryan or Nazi ideology here for the French Academy. Matisse's criticism would equally apply. This broadcast across Vichy, France, made Matisse's political beliefs crystal clear to anyone who was paying attention. So now we turn our attention specifically to jazz, which was likely called Cirque or Circus. The circus was a theme that unified people, for adults and children to come together to laugh and forget their hardships. But might it have a secondary anti-Aryan meaning? The circus sometimes ran counter to Aryan ideals of physical perfection and racial and ethnic purity. Gypsies and circus performers were part of the freaks and the marginalized, typical of those people that Hitler condemned. The circus, with its display of social diversity, represented France's progressive values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. While the circumstances of the title change of the book remain unclear, eventually Tériade convinced Matisse to change the name of their forthcoming collaboration to Jazz. Now, the title change may be as simple as motivated by the elegant calligraphic quality that the word jazz allows. It is quite lovely, but could it also have an undercurrent of political resistance as well? Jazz was seen as quintessentially American, urban, and multicultural, everything that the fascists were against. Following the Degenerate Art Exhibition in 1937, the Nazis opened Degenerate Music exhibit in 1938, which featured jazz prominently. Negro music was a derogatory term used by the Nazis to demonize musical styles that had been invented by Black people, such as jazz and blues. In 1930, the American musician Henry Cowell wrote that jazz was, quote, Negro music seen through the eyes of the Jews. This was then followed by a full legal ban on the music, October 12, 1935, across all German radio. On the flip side, Allied forces used jazz as counter-propaganda when the American Forces Network radio broadcasts to denounce fascist oppression in Europe. But most of the imagery is about the circus. Like the nightmare of the white elephant. Here, we see an elephant standing on a ball in the brilliant light of the circus. White, a symbol of captivity, purity, or victimization, while the red can symbolize suffering. The black resembles vegetation, perhaps from the elephant's homeland, a piece beyond the restrictive bright yellow lights that he cannot reach. Regardless of its exact meaning, this image seems to convey a sense of confinement, anguish, brutality, through the undulating whips and lassos, the jagged red form that seems to pierce the body of the elephant. In short, the elephant balancing on the circus ball depicts the precariousness of life. Matisse revealed, "The white elephant, it is me." The sword swallower. Is this a circus performer, or could it be a torture victim? Is that a tear of pain that we see? Could the red, white, and black in the uppermost part of the image reference the tricolor of Nazism? It's literally shoving it down the throat of the persecuted. Considered within the context of the occupation, the swimmer in the tank may also show another victim of violence. The stark white body, perhaps nude, arms and legs splayed wide on top of a split black background, becomes a dark, ominous image, perhaps portraying a dead body floating down the river. The overt voyeurism is also particularly disturbing. Is the passive, ambivalent witness unable or unwilling to help? Again, the violence of the act is front and center in the image called the cowboy. This could perhaps be symbolic of the oppressor or the occupier on the left, whipping the right-hand figure who's arched back in pain as the whip curls around its body, the oppressed or the occupied. But could the cowboy also be a reference to the United States? A symbol of American freedom, perhaps the Allies who are about to invade, about to rope the invaders? Destiny is certainly a hard image to read. According to Lydia, the small human couple in white kneel, fearfully entwined in the face of a menacing and dangerous destiny on the opposite half of the plate. She recalled that it was created during one of the darkest days of World War II. Matisse's friend Aragon described Icarus as being like a corpse. And from what Matisse had said to him, it seems that the splashes of yellow, suns or stars, if you want to be mythological, were exploding shells in 1943, and the red patch resembles a stain of blood. From the very first time I saw the image of the knife thrower, all I saw was political victim with hands held high in surrender. The figure on the left side of the composition oozes violent menace, like a Nazi agent with his rifle. To drive the point home, Matisse shows the aggressor on the left with sharp angles and a dominating purple, while the victim on the right with soft curves in a more visually pastel form of purple. Matisse's wolf is a particularly interesting image, layered with alternate interpretations. The wolf from Little Red Riding Hood, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Either way, a coded image of betrayal. Betrayal was ubiquitous during the occupation, and in the case of the Matisse family, was very real. After Marguerite's arrest, a female Gestapo agent dressed in her clothes to impersonate her. Amélie, expecting Marguerite's return, unknowingly welcomed the stranger into her apartment. Amélie was immediately arrested as well. A secondary reading is simply a symbol for the Gestapo. Even the Russians did that. This is a Russian TASS poster in our collection. Wolf would have been seen as a symbol of the Nazis. Or it could also reference the Italian troops that entered Nice in November of 1942. They were called the Lupi di Toscana, the wolves of Tuscany. And here is the plate that's called Monsieur Loyal, which is the French expression for ringmaster or circus master, framed against the profile as a very blue, a very French blue. In the French flag, that blue represents liberty, and many have commented on the similarity to Charles de Gaulle's profile, the hat, the nose, and the chin most notably. The yellow circles could represent the buttons on his military uniform. Could Matisse be equating de Gaulle to a ringmaster who's literally rallying the troops? On June 6, 1944, the Allied forces landed in Normandy, signaling the beginning of the liberation. And it was during the tumultuous period that Matisse commenced on the 3 lagoon compositions, possibly the final images he executed for jazz. These tranquil images are very different in style and interpretation from the others. The calm of the lagoon reflects the high expectations of the liberation. They form a bridge from the jarring wartime images to the peacefulness of the text that he worked on from 1945 to 46, after he completed the images and the liberation of France. And as I conclude, I do not want to assert that these alternate interpretations are the only way to understand these images, that Matisse was only making an anti-fascist publication, not at all. I'm merely sharing that the true genius and beauty of jazz, its enduring legacy, is its multi-layered meaning, the way that each one of us can take something different from it. And because I want to end our time together on an uplifting note, just like Matisse intended, I'll conclude with one of my favorite passages from jazz. Hate is an all-devouring parasite. Love, on the other hand, sustains the artist. And with that, thank you. So I think we have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a staff member will bring you a microphone so that we can all hear the question.
We have one right here.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I noticed some overlap in both themes and forms between Matisse and Alexander Calder, who also had a circus series. I'm wondering if you're aware whether or not they had a relationship of any kind? And that may be outside your purview.
Yes and no. The second part of your question, I can't really answer because I'm so narrowly focused on Matisse. But when we were first conceiving the exhibition, I did delve into other circus imagery, and we do have circus images by Calder in the collection that I contemplated using. But yes, you're absolutely right. Visually, yes, there's connective tissue there. Maybe somebody who has more experience with Calder in the audience can explain whether or not they met. I don't know off the top of my head.
We've got another question up top here.
Have comparisons been made between the cutouts and quilting? Because I see a lot of crossover.
Well, I wouldn't say in quilting, but what's very interesting is that Matisse was raised by, I think his family had textiles, so he had that sort of in his blood, in his family. So those enormous shears that he had, he was very easy. It was easy for him to handle them. But in terms of quilting, I can't really answer that. But fabrics, textiles, it ran in the Matisse family.
Yes, I'm interested in his draftsman skills because in one of the galleries we have those graphite drawings which look really kind of immature almost, but yet you contrast that with his beautiful lines and free-flowing lines in the inks. And can you comment a little bit about his draftsmanship?
Well, it certainly evolved over time. That's a really good question. If you, at least at one point in 42, obviously because of his surgery, because he wasn't able to paint, he focused on drawing for quite a long time. And that's when we get that book, Matisse's Drawings, Themes and Variations. He just exploded drawings, really working on the simplification of his line, how one line, if there's a portrait in the show where literally one line comes from her nose and it's in her entire face, just one continuous line. And he believed that that was the most significant development that he made to that point. But how do you translate? He says, but that's not a painting, that line, that beautiful, exquisite line. And so he was able to translate that elegant line, that calligraphic line, to cut paper. So those line drawings, those very simple, and in fact, it goes even farther back to the poems of Mallarmé, those beautiful etchings with very simple line, no shading, no ground, just the line. That is essential to get to jazz. Because then if you think of those lines then with scissors, then you've got the image, the cutout. So his line over the course of his career evolves and is simplified to its most elemental. I don't know if that answers your question. A little bit?
So T.J. Clark, a few years ago, I think, kind of derided Matisse's cutouts as delivery sensation systems void of social content. I get the sense from your lecture that maybe you see it differently. And I find
A little.
which I find to be quite compelling. I wonder if you could maybe speak to like clarifying how you feel about the social content of
Social
paintings.
content. I will be completely honest and frank. There's always been in a sort of modern art history this sort of push and pull dichotomy between Picasso and Matisse. And there's this sort of, oh, you can't be in either camp. And I've always been firmly in Picasso's camp because the art says more. Matisse is beautiful and sensual and expressionistic, but it didn't really speak to me until I did this project. And I'm not saying that he's not Picasso. He's still not Picasso. Picasso's still my man. But I think that it was a product of the time in which it was created. I don't think that you can now go back and say, oh, jazz has all these multi-layered meanings, so let's go back and look at the odalisques from the 20s. I don't think the same applies. It was a very sort of unfortunate flash in the pan when you just can't not react to what's going on around you. I still believe that Matisse's art is meant to be sensual. There's a quote that has been used it's been used improperly, but basically he says his paintings are like a fine armchair, that you're supposed to be comfortable with them. And I think that's just an oversimplification, but I don't know if that answers your question. Anything else? If not, have a wonderful, happy Friday the 13th.